The medieval torture device locked around Margaret's head was designed exclusively for women who spoke too freely. Iron teeth punctured her tongue at exactly 9:47 on an ordinary Tuesday morning in Edinburgh's fish market. Blood mixed with saliva pooled behind the metal bit as leather straps creaked tighter against her jaw. Merchants continued hawking their wares just 20 feet away. This was routine, after all. The Scold's bridle would remain locked for 3 months, transforming every attempt at speech into agony, every swallow into torture. The crowd knew her crime was disturbing the peace. They didn't know that meant correcting a priest's Latin. The morning sun cast shadows through the bridle's iron framework across Margaret's face. Church bells rang the hour as magistrates tightened the final strap. Her husband stood among the crowd, eyes downcast. The law required his presence. Watching your wife's bridling was considered a civic duty. Children peered between their mothers' skirts, learning early what happened to women who forgot their place. The fishmonger next to Margaret's usual stall looked away as blood dripped onto cobblestones. This was the 16th bridling this year. Edinburgh's metalworkers had perfected the design, not tight enough to kill, not loose enough to allow clear speech. The device would teach its lesson through seasons of silence. Margaret's eyes found her daughter in the crowd. The girl was 12, old enough to understand the warning being carved into her mother's face, old enough to learn that knowledge itself could be a crime when spoken through female lips. How did Christianity's story of Eve's apple transform into iron instruments that specifically targeted female anatomy? And why did medieval craftsmen spend months perfecting devices that turned women's own bodies into torture chambers? To understand Margaret's bleeding tongue, you need to rewind through centuries of theological doctrine that transformed paradise, lost into workshops where men forged suffering with mathematical precision. The journey from scripture to Scold's bridle reveals humanity's darkest creativity, the industrialization of gendered punishment. The young priest's quill scratched across parchment. Woman is the gateway through which the devil enters. Brother Thomas bent over his writing desk in the monastery of Saint Denis, copying Tertullian's words by candlelight in 1387. Outside, November rain drummed against stone walls. Inside, doctrine was being shaped that would echo through centuries of suffering. The Latin flowed smoothly. He'd memorized these passages about female spiritual weakness during his novitiate. Women were daughters of Eve, carriers of original sin, vessels of temptation. The Church Fathers had been clear on this point. Thomas added his own commentary in the margins, noting that female correction was therefore a holy duty. But the young priest wasn't finished with his theological exploration. In the next chamber, Prior Guillaume was composing something far more practical, a manual for identifying female heresy. The symptoms were specific: speaking during male conversation, questioning church doctrine, showing signs of learning beyond household management. Guillaume's pen paused over one particular passage. He was detailing how Eve's curse manifested in contemporary women. The desire for knowledge, he wrote, was the first sign of corruption. When women sought to interpret scripture or correct male understanding, they reenacted Eden's first sin. The monastery's library held volumes on female nature. Aquinas had written that women were misbegotten males, incomplete beings prone to deception. Augustine traced female suffering directly to Eve's transgression. These weren't abstract theological debates. They were blueprints for social order. Each manuscript contained careful instructions for managing female weakness. Prayer alone wasn't sufficient. Physical correction might be required. The Archbishop's latest letter had been explicit about this necessity. What the monks wrote next would literally shape iron into female form. Prior Guillaume's manual included detailed specifications for correction devices. The measurements were precise based on female anatomy studies conducted by church physicians. Devices should cause pain without permanent damage, ensure silence without preventing breathing, create suffering that would remind women of their inherited guilt. The drawings showed hinged metal frames, adjustable straps, positioning of pressure points. This wasn't cruelty, it was theological engineering. The scriptoriums across Europe hummed with similar work. In Prague, monks translated Greek texts about female hysteria. In Cologne, theologians debated the spiritual benefits of enforced silence. In Rome, Church lawyers drafted legal frameworks that made female correction a husband's religious obligation. The intellectual architecture of oppression was being assembled piece by careful piece. Each manuscript copied, each treatise shared between monasteries, each sermon preached from these texts, all of it building toward iron inevitability. Brother Thomas finished his copying as dawn approached. His final notation concerned the practical application of doctrine. Women who spoke in church, who questioned male authority, who demonstrated learning beyond their station, these weren't just social violations. They were theological crimes, direct challenges to the order God established in Eden. The prior would be pleased with his additions. Thomas had connected ancient scripture to contemporary practice, showing how Eve's punishment must be continually reenacted to maintain divine order. The manuscript would travel to Paris within the month, carried by pilgrims. From there, copies would spread to universities and noble courts. Judges would cite these passages in sentencing. Husbands would reference them in requesting correction devices. Craftsmen would study the anatomical drawings when forging their implements. The transformation from idea to iron was already beginning. In workshops across Europe, blacksmiths were receiving commissions for devices that would enforce the silence these monks prescribed. And when the blueprints left the monastery, they carried measurements taken from actual women's bodies. The blacksmith heated the 4 iron claws until they glowed like dying suns against the dawn. Munich's Marienplatz filled with citizens as the church bells announced the 7th hour. They gathered not from bloodlust but civic duty. Attending public punishments was required by city ordinance. The crowd formed a semicircle around the raised platform where Anna Pappenheimer waited. She'd been accused of witchcraft after healing local children with herb mixtures. Success where university physicians failed was evidence enough of diabolic assistance. The morning air carried the acrid smell of hot metal from the brazier, where Hans the executioner prepared his implements. Anna had nursed 6 children at the breast they would destroy today. The irony wasn't lost on the crowd. Many had brought their own sick children to her door just months ago, but testimony was testimony. Her neighbour swore she'd seen Anna collecting herbs by moonlight. Another claimed Anna's cats spoke to her in human voices. The trial lasted 3 days. The verdict was never in doubt. But the breast ripper was reserved for special cases, women who'd corrupted the maternal role itself. Hans lifted the device from the coals with heavy tongs. The 4 claws glowed cherry red in the morning light. He'd sharpened them yesterday, tested the hinged mechanism that would allow them to close with mechanical precision. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible as metal rang against metal. Mothers in the audience instinctively covered their chests. Fathers held their positions, many having paid for front-row placement. The priest began reading Anna's crimes in Latin. His voice carried across the square, mixing with the hiss of hot iron meeting morning air. But Hans wasn't finished with his preparation. He had 2 more implements heating in the brazier. The breast ripper was merely the beginning of Anna's scheduled punishments. The city council had specified a precise sequence designed to last exactly 1 hour. Too quick, and the lesson would be lost. Too long, and death might intervene before justice was complete. Hans had performed this duty for 15 years. He knew exactly how much the human body could endure. Anna's children stood in the designated family area. City law required their attendance watching maternal punishment was considered educational. Her eldest daughter, Maria, kept her eyes fixed on her mother's face. At 16, Maria was old enough to be married, old enough to understand that her mother's fate could easily become her own. The herbs Anna had taught her to gather, the healing songs she'd learned at her mother's knee, all of it was dangerous knowledge now. The church bells began their solemn toll. Hans approached with measured steps. The crowd fell silent except for the crackling of the brazier and the distant sound of normal city life continuing beyond the square. Merchants still hawked their wares on adjoining streets. Carriages rattled over cobblestones. Munich continued its morning routine while Anna Pappenheimer prepared to have motherhood itself torn from her body. The device's application followed ritual precision. Hans had marked the positioning with chalk. Symmetry was important for both practical and symbolic reasons. The crowd watched him work with professional detachment. Several artists sketched the scene for later reproduction in broadsheets. The city chronicler took notes for official records. This wasn't barbarism. It was civilization enforcing its boundaries through calculated suffering. What happened to women who stepped outside their prescribed roles needed to be remembered, recorded, repeated. When Hans stepped back, Anna's punishment had only just begun. The breast ripper had done its work, but the morning's schedule included 2 more devices. The crowd settled in for the full hour. Vendors worked the edges of the gathering, selling warm bread and ale. Children fidgeted until parents lifted them onto shoulders for better views. The priest continued his Latin recitation, now describing how Eve's daughters must be prevented from corrupting future generations. But the breast ripper was only the first of 3 devices waiting for Anna that morning. The iron chair sat ready beside the platform, its protruding spikes already heated. The head crusher waited in its wooden frame, screws freshly oiled for smooth operation. Hans followed the prescribed sequence without emotion. He was a craftsman, nothing more. The real architects of this suffering wore ecclesiastical robes and judicial gowns. They stood in the viewing gallery, nodding approval as each phase proceeded according to plan. Anna Pappenheimer would live through all 3 devices. Hans was too skilled to allow accidental mercy through death. The metal petals opened inside her with the slow precision of a clockwork nightmare made real. Venice's Palace of the Doges housed many secrets in 1575, but none more terrible than the collection in the underwater chambers. Caterina Vizzani faced her accusers in the torch-lit stone room, where water lapped against the walls at high tide. Her crime was loving another woman, Margherita del Nero, who'd already faced her own trial the previous week. The magistrates passed the device between themselves, admiring its craftsmanship. Venetian metalworkers were renowned for creating beauty from base materials. This particular pair was their darkest masterwork. The device resembled an oversized metal bulb when closed, no larger than a child's fist. But the screw mechanism at its base controlled 4 segments that would expand outward when turned. The surface bore decorative etchings flowering vines wrapped around each segment. Venice's torturers took pride in their artistic sensibilities. Even implements of suffering should please the eye. The lead magistrate held it up to the torchlight, demonstrating the mechanism to his colleagues. Each revolution of the screw caused the segments to spread wider, like some mechanical flower blooming in slow motion. Caterina had lived as a man for 3 years, working as a clerk in the merchant district. Her disguise had been perfect until Margherita's husband discovered their correspondence. The letters spoke of love in poetic terms, comparing their affection to classical myths, but the court saw only perversion of God's natural order. The mechanical clicking of the screw mechanism echoed off stone walls as the magistrate continued his demonstration. 1 revolution, 2, 3. The metal petals spread obscenely wide, but here's where it gets worse. The pair wasn't designed for death. Death would end the lesson too quickly. The device's true horror lay in its precision engineering, expanded just enough to tear but not enough to kill. The victim would survive, would heal, would live with the consequences for decades. The internal scars would serve as permanent reminder of transgression. Every intimate moment for the rest of their lives would echo with pain. The body itself would become the prison. The crowd had been excluded from this particular punishment. Some horrors were too specific for public display. Only court officials, the attending physician, and the recording clerk witnessed what happened next. The physician's role was crucial, monitoring breathing, checking pulse, ensuring consciousness remained throughout. Venice prided itself on scientific punishment. This wasn't medieval brutality but Renaissance precision, the careful application of measured suffering to achieve maximum psychological impact. Caterina's last coherent words before the device's insertion were recorded by the clerk. "Love is not the crime you think it is." The magistrates found this statement further evidence of her corruption. To love outside God's design, and then defend such love, showed complete spiritual decay. The screw turned with mechanical precision. 1 click, 2 clicks, 3 clicks. The physician monitored vital signs, nodding to continue. The expansion proceeded according to protocol. The silence in the chamber was absolute except for the rhythmic clicking of the mechanism and the water against stone. No screams. The device's positioning prevented that. No please speech was impossible. Only the sound of mechanism meeting flesh, of precision engineering doing exactly what it was designed to do. The clerk's quill scratched across parchment, recording each revolution of the screw, each nod from the physician, each stage of the prescribed punishment. When they finally reversed the mechanism, when the metal petals slowly closed and the device was withdrawn, Caterina Visani had been transformed. Not dead, that would have been merciful. Not even visibly wounded, her clothing would hide any external signs, but irreversibly changed in ways that would manifest every day for the rest of her life. The physician pronounced the punishment successfully completed. The clerk signed and sealed the official record. The magistrates retired to their chambers, satisfied that God's order had been restored. She would live another 40 years, but she would never speak above a whisper again. Venice kept careful records of all its judicial proceedings. Caterina's file notes her release the following morning, her return to women's clothing, her withdrawal from public life. It doesn't record the blood she coughed up for months afterward. It doesn't mention how she flinched at any sudden movement. It doesn't describe the nightmares that would wake her, gasping and clutching at her throat, for 4 decades. The Pear of Anguish remained in Venice's collection until Napoleon's invasion. Soldiers found it among other devices, still decorated with those delicate floral etchings, still opening with the same mechanical precision, still carrying the invisible history of women like Caterina Visani, whose only crime was loving outside the boundaries men had drawn. The device exists in a private collection today, its mechanisms still functional, its metal petals still waiting to bloom their particular species of pain. Master Zimmermann measured the village women's faces while they slept, preparing his commission for the magistrate. The metalworking shop in Augsburg hummed with activity in the pre-dawn hours of 1540. Apprentices stoked the forge, while journeymen prepared their tools. But this wasn't ordinary smithwork. Zimmermann specialized in judicial implements devices ordered by courts and husbands across the Holy Roman Empire. His reputation for precision was unmatched. When a bridle needed to fit perfectly, when a belt required exact pressure points, clients came to Zimmermann. He kept detailed measurements of female anatomy in leather-bound journals, organized by age and social class. Young Wilhelm, the newest apprentice, watched his master work with fascination and growing unease. Zimmermann was sketching a new design by candlelight, a modified Scold's bridle requested by the Burger's Wife Committee. Standard bridles were proving insufficient for market women whose strong jaws could resist the pressure. This new design would include adjustable side plates and a double-pronged tongue depressor. Wilhelm ground iron filings for the forge, trying not to think about mouths that would bleed. The workshop walls displayed Zimmermann's innovations like a gallery of horrors. Charcoal sketches showed female forms from every angle, annotated with measurements and stress points. Here, a diagram of optimal chain lengths for different height ranges. There, a study of joint flexibility to maximize restraint without dislocation. The master approached his craft with the dedication of an artist and the precision of an engineer. Pain was simply another material to be shaped, refined, perfected through careful iteration. But Zimmermann's true innovation lay in customization. Generic devices were for common craftsmen. His clients paid premium prices for implements tailored to specific women. He'd developed a system of nocturnal measurements bribing servants to grant access while targets slept. A few moments with calipers and measuring tape ensured perfect fit. The rasp of file against iron filled the workshop as apprentices shaped metal to match these stolen dimensions. Each device that left Zimmermann's shop was as unique as the woman it would torment. The morning's commission presented particular challenges. Frau Hoffmann, wife of a prominent merchant, had been speaking publicly about her husband's business practices. Her husband wanted something subtle, a device that could be worn under clothing during social gatherings. Zimmermann sketched a modified iron corset with internal prongs positioned at speaking points. When she attempted to project her voice, the prongs would dig deeper. Silence or suffering, the choice would be hers. Wilhelm watched his master calculate the exact angles needed to achieve this effect. Orders arrived daily from across the empire. Husbands seeking domestic correction devices, magistrates requiring implements for public punishment, church officials commissioning items for moral instruction. Zimmerman maintained careful records of each transaction. His ledgers showed increasing demand year over year. The Reformation had created new anxieties about female behavior. Every social upheaval seemed to require new methods of control. Business was thriving in the intersection of fear and iron. The apprentices learned more than metalwork in Zimmerman's shop. They studied female anatomy through the lens of vulnerability. They memorized pressure points and breaking limits. They calculated the exact force needed to cause submission without death. Wilhelm's fellow apprentices competed to create the most innovative designs. Klaus had developed a thumbscrew specifically sized for women's smaller joints. Hans perfected a gag that allowed breathing but prevented any intelligible sound. Each innovation was tested, refined, improved through systematic experimentation. By noon, the workshop had produced 3 completed devices. A Scold's bridle with specialized bit for a baker's wife who'd contradicted her husband in public. An iron belt for a young bride whose father wanted to ensure virginity until her wedding night. A set of weighted chains designed to be worn during church services by women prone to fidgeting. Each implement was wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, tagged with the client's name, prepared for delivery. The craft of cruelty was also the craft of customer service. The youngest apprentice would later use these same skills to create something even worse than torture devices. Wilhelm's journals, discovered centuries later, revealed his growing obsession with perfecting restraint. After completing his apprenticeship, he opened his own workshop specializing exclusively in devices for controlling female movement. His innovations included articulated joints that mimicked natural motion while preventing specific actions. A woman could walk but not run, sit but not stand without permission, move her arms but not raise them above waist height. The human body became a puzzle to be solved through metal and mathematics. Lord Pemberton locked his wife in iron on their wedding night. It was his legal right, after all. The spring of 1560 brought fresh flowers to Thornfield Manor's gardens, but Lady Catherine Pemberton experienced only the unchanging pressure of metal against flesh. The iron corset had been her wedding gift presented by her husband after the ceremony, as insurance against willfulness. She'd laughed nervously, thinking it a jest. The wedding guests had applauded when Lord Pemberton demonstrated the locking mechanism. They understood the symbolism. Marriage transformed women from their father's property to their husbands. The corset simply made that ownership visible. 3 months had passed since that night. The device encircled her torso from breast to hip. 18 pounds of fitted iron that compressed her organs with calculated precision. The internal architecture was ingenious, flexible enough to allow basic movement, rigid enough to enforce perpetual discomfort. Each breath was shallow, measured against metal resistance. Eating became an ordeal of tiny portions. Sleep arrived only through exhaustion. But Lord Pemberton was satisfied. His wife no longer spoke at social gatherings without permission. The corset had achieved its purpose. The household servants knew but could offer no aid. Margaret, Catherine's lady's maid, helped her dress each morning, layering fabric to hide the device's outline. The other wives at church knew many had worn similar devices during their own adjustment periods. It was discussed in whispers, normalized through shared suffering. Lady Pemberton's transgression had been mild by most standards. She'd contradicted her husband during a dinner party, suggesting alternative investment strategies for his shipping ventures. Such public undermining required correction, but the corset's true cruelty lay in its duration. Lord Pemberton had specified 6 months long enough for permanent psychological modification. The metal became part of Catherine's body awareness. She moved differently, thought differently, existed differently within its embrace. Internal bleeding had started in the 2nd month. The physician, summoned discreetly, pronounced it normal. Women's bodies would adapt, he assured Lord Pemberton. The bleeding would stop once she learned proper submission. He prescribed laudanum for the worst days and praised the husband's firm guidance. Summer arrived with its heat, transforming the iron into a portable furnace. The metal absorbed and retained warmth, cooking her slowly from outside in. Servants found her collapsed in the garden, her body temperature dangerously elevated. Lord Pemberton allowed a single modification, small breathing holes drilled at the sides. The local blacksmith performed the adjustment, while Catherine remained locked inside. The drill's vibration against her ribs sent new waves of agony through already damaged tissue, but she could breathe slightly deeper. Her husband's mercy was noted and appreciated. The harvest season brought new challenges. As lady of the manor, Catherine had social obligations that couldn't be avoided. She hosted dinner parties while organs shifted against metal constraints. She danced at autumn celebrations while fighting waves of nausea from compressed intestines. She smiled and conversed and performed her role while her body slowly failed inside its iron prison. The other ladies pretended not to notice her careful movements, her shallow breathing, the way she gripped furniture for support when she thought no one was watching. Lord Pemberton kept careful notes on his wife's progress. Her speech had become properly deferential. Her opinions, when rarely offered, aligned perfectly with his own. The investment strategies she'd once challenged had failed spectacularly, a fact he reminded her of daily. The corset was proving more effective than he'd hoped. Not just physical control, but complete psychological reconstruction. He'd already recommended the device to several friends dealing with their own willful wives. The blacksmith was taking orders for custom fittings. On the night before the corset's scheduled removal, Catherine served the harvest feast to 50 guests. She moved through the great hall with practiced grace, the iron's weight distributed through learned posture. No one suspected that blood was pooling in her shoes, that her vision greyed at the edges, that each breath was a calculated effort against metal resistance. She was the perfect hostess, the ideal wife, the success story of marital correction. Lord Pemberton accepted congratulations from his peers. 6 months of firm guidance had transformed a willful woman into a proper wife. When they finally removed the corset, what they found underneath defied medical explanation. The metal had left its mark not just on skin but on the architecture of her body itself. Ribs had reformed around constant pressure. Organs had relocated to accommodate iron intrusion. The physician documented what he called successful adaptation to marital guidance. Catherine would live another 20 years, bearing 4 children despite the damage. But she would never again speak of business matters, never again offer opinions that hadn't been pre-approved, never again forget that her body belonged to someone else. The corset had been removed, but its lesson remained encoded in bent bones and compressed organs. The clerk's neat handwriting recorded her screams in triplicate proper documentation was essential for legal torture. Heinrich Müller dipped his quill in fresh ink, preparing Form 7b, authorization for enhanced interrogation of suspected witch, female. The Cologne torture chamber operated with Germanic efficiency in 1592, every scream catalogued, every confession properly witnessed. The adjoining office held filing cabinets of similar forms, cross-referenced by date, crime, and devices employed. Müller had served as senior clerk for 5 years. He'd developed a shorthand system for recording various types of scream-sharp dots for acute pain, wavy lines for prolonged agony, circled notations for when consciousness was lost. The morning's subject was Greta Holst, midwife, accused of causing stillbirths through malefaction. 3 witnesses had provided sworn testimony. The judge had signed preliminary authorization. Now came the careful documentation of confession extraction. Müller prepared his materials: fresh parchment, backup quills, sealing wax, witness signature lines. The torturer, Klaus Weber, reviewed his own checklist: device preparation times, physician availability, confession verification procedures. Modern torture wasn't barbaric, it was administrative. The fee structure was posted clearly on the office wall. Basic interrogation, 2 gulden. Enhanced techniques, 5 gulden. Overnight sessions, 10 gulden, plus overtime for staff. The city council had standardized pricing after complaints of arbitrary charging. Torture was a municipal service like any other. It required proper funding, trained personnel, quality control measures. Müller's office maintained detailed budgets. Ink costs were itemized alongside iron maintenance. Physician consultations were balanced against confession conviction rates. The bureaucracy of suffering operated on sound fiscal principles. But Müller's real innovation was temporal documentation. Each session was logged with minute-by-minute precision. 8:47. Subject secured to chair. 8:52. Thumbscrews applied. quarter turn. 8:54. First vocalization recorded. 8:58. Confession regarding dancing naked at Sabbath. The timestamp system allowed for quality review. If confessions were extracted too quickly, validity might be questioned. Too slowly suggested inefficient technique. The optimal window was 45 minutes to 2 hours. Muller's records helped torturers refine their timing. The administrative requirements were extensive. Before any device could be applied, forms needed completion. Medical assessment of the subject's capacity to endure questioning. Witness statements establishing probable cause. Judicial review of proposed techniques. Clerical presence to ensure accurate recording. Physician attendance to prevent premature death. The framework protected both the state and the torturer from accusations of excess. Everything was legal, authorized, documented. The screams that echoed through stone walls were preceded by properly filed paperwork. Muller maintained special ledgers for female subjects. Women required different documentation than men. Their supposed weakness meant adjusted techniques, modified devices, careful monitoring. But their tendency toward hysteria also meant confessions needed additional verification. The forms included specific sections. Did subject call upon Satan during questioning? Were tears of repentance or manipulation observed? Did confession include details beyond prompter's suggestions? The gendered bureaucracy reflected theological assumptions about female nature. The cost of maintaining such detailed records was considerable. Muller employed 3 junior clerks to handle filing, copying, and organization. The archive required constant expansion. Cross-referencing systems grew increasingly complex as cases accumulated. But the investment paid dividends during witch panics. When accusations spiraled, when entire villages faced suspicion, the bureaucracy provided structure. Forms prevented chaos. Documentation distinguished legitimate interrogation from mob violence. The torture chamber was civilization's answer to superstition. But one clerk kept a secret second ledger that would eventually expose the entire system. Johann Schmidt, Muller's most trusted assistant, had begun recording discrepancies. Confessions that didn't match between sessions. Witnesses who changed stories after payment. Physicians who signed health assessments without examinations. Schmidt's hidden ledger grew thick with evidence of systemic corruption. The bureaucracy that legitimized torture also created paper trails of its own criminality. Every forged document, every bribed official, every altered record, Schmidt documented it all. The secret ledger would remain hidden for 3 years while Schmidt gathered evidence. He noted which judges ordered torture regardless of evidence, which torturers exceeded authorized techniques, which clerks accepted bribes to alter records. The very precision that made the system function also made its corruption traceable. When Schmidt finally presented his evidence to reform-minded counselors, the bureaucracy's own documentation would damn it. Thousands of forms, properly filed and stamped, revealing assembly line atrocity dressed in administrative propriety. The paperwork of pain would ultimately testify against its creators. The alewife's bridle bore special modifications, longer spikes for those whose livelihood required speaking. Norwich Market Square buzzed with commerce in 1563, but the sound was changing. Where once female voices had dominated the morning trade, calling prices and haggling with customers, now men's deeper tones increasingly filled the air. The systematic bridling of successful female merchants wasn't random. It was economic warfare dressed as moral correction. Agnes Brewster felt the weight of inevitability as she watched another competitor fitted with iron. The Male Brewers Guild had filed their 5th complaint against her this month. Her ale was too popular, her prices too competitive, her presence too threatening. The correlation was unmistakable in guild records. As female merchants gained market share, bridling rates soared. The timing was never coincidental. Margaret the fishwife bridled just after securing exclusive supplier contracts. Joan the baker silenced the week she'd announced expansion plans. Elizabeth the weaver muted after undercutting guild prices. The male merchants who filed complaints always benefited directly. Their stalls expanded into the spaces left empty. Their profits rose as female competition literally couldn't speak to customers. The Scold's Bridle had become a tool of commercial elimination. Agnes had built her brewing business over 15 years. She knew every customer's preference, every tavern keeper's schedule, every harvest season's yield potential. Her voice was her primary business tool, calling out daily specials, negotiating bulk orders, managing her team of assistant brewers. The bridle designed for her included specialized modifications: extended tongue spikes to prevent any attempt at muffled communication, reinforced jaw hinges to resist her strong facial muscles, a bell attachment to announce her shameful presence. The Male Brewers Guild had specified each cruel detail. The economic data was stark. Before systematic bridling began, women controlled 60% of Norwich's ale trade. They dominated fish sales, bread baking, and textile retail. Their voices created the market's soundscape, hawking wares, arguing prices, building customer relationships through daily conversation. But as bridling increased, those percentages shifted dramatically. Within 2 years, male merchants controlled 70% of previously female-dominated trades. The marketplace reorganized around who could speak and who was forced into silence. The guild meetings that coordinated these campaigns were documented in careful detail. Members discussed which women posed the greatest competitive threats. They pooled resources to hire witnesses who would testify about disruption and unseemly behavior. They drafted formal complaints emphasizing moral rather than economic concerns. A woman's business success was reframed as evidence of unwomanly ambition. Her necessary marketplace shouting became disturbing the peace. Her negotiations were recast as shrewish argument. The language of morality masked calculated commercial destruction, but the bridled women found ways to resist. Agnes developed a system of hand signals with loyal customers. Her assistants became her voice, relaying messages while she stood silently bleeding. Other bridled merchants created written signs. Though literacy accusations could bring worse punishments, they formed silent networks, supporting each other through gesture and presence. The marketplace became a theater of resistance performed without words. Every successful transaction, despite bridling, was a small victory against economic annihilation. The younger generation of female merchants watched and learned. They saw Agnes's bloody silence and understood its message. Some abandoned their ambitions, retreating to acceptable domestic invisibility. Others adapted, learning to operate through male proxies or limiting their success to non-threatening levels. But they all understood the equation: economic power plus female body equaled inevitable punishment. The bridle waited for any woman who forgot this mathematics of oppression. The last female merchant in Norwich had just received notice. Her bridle was already being fitted. Sarah Carpenter had survived longer than most by carefully managing her visibility. She kept her carpenter's workshop small, her prices slightly above male competitors, her voice soft, even when calling to customers. But her quality was undeniable. Customers sought her furniture despite guild pressure. Her success, modest as she kept it, was still too much. The complaint filed against her cited unseemly pride in workmanship and corrupting young women with ambitions beyond their station. The bridle maker had already taken her measurements. Sarah's bridling would mark the end of an era. Norwich Marketplace would become an exclusively male commercial space. The economic transformation was complete. Where once female voices had created a cacophony of commerce, now only men's tones carried across the square. The silent women who still attended market moved like ghosts through their former domain. Some wore bridles. Others had learned silence without iron instruction. All understood that the marketplace-like speech itself was territory they occupied only at male sufferance. The economics of the Scold's Bridle had achieved its purpose: the total colonization of female economic space. The Malefis House, Bamberg's custom-built witch prison, operated with factory precision in 1627. Prince Bishop Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim had commissioned the facility to handle increasing caseloads. Traditional torture chambers proved insufficient for the scale of persecution he envisioned. The new building featured multiple examination rooms, holding cells for various stages of processing, and innovative pulley systems that allowed devices to be quickly repositioned. Efficiency experts from the mining industry had consulted on the design. Suffering was industrialized, systematized, optimized for maximum throughput. The daily routine began at dawn. Guards roused prisoners from communal cells where they'd spent the night listening to screams from the examination rooms. The scheduling board showed 17 names, the facility's proven daily capacity. First shift torturers arrived at 6, checking their assigned rooms and devices. The maintenance crew had worked overnight, oiling mechanisms, sharpening implements, ensuring smooth operation. Nothing could delay the schedule. Prince Bishop Fuchs reviewed productivity reports each evening. Falling below quota meant administrative consequences. The morning shift processed suspects through preliminary examination. Station 1. Initial questioning and intimidation. Station 2. Display of instruments with detailed explanation of their function. Station 3. Light persuasion techniques, thumb screws, leg vices, simple restraints. Most women confessed by Station 3. The assembly line moved them efficiently from admission to confession, each stage calibrated to break resistance without premature death. Torturers rotated between stations to prevent fatigue. Fresh arms meant consistent pressure application. But here's where it gets worse. The Malefizos had perfected psychological efficiency alongside physical systems. Children were brought to watch their mothers' examinations. The sound of familiar screams broke small spirits faster than any device. Daughters saw what awaited them. Sons learned what authority looked like. The viewing galleries allowed multiple psychological destructions per physical torture. One woman's agony educated entire families in the price of accusation. The economy of suffering maximized every scream's impact. The facility's innovation extended to record-keeping. Pre-printed confession forms standardized admissions. Checkboxes for common accusations, Sabbath attendance, demon copulation, weather magic sped documentation. Clerks simply marked appropriate boxes as women screamed agreement. The forms included spaces for accomplice names, ensuring steady supply for the assembly line. Each processed which generated 3 to 5 new accusations. The mathematics of persecution were self-sustaining. Production bred production in an endless cycle of manufactured guilt. Lunch breaks were staggered to maintain continuous operation. Torturers ate in shifts while screams provided dining music. The facility kitchen prepared meals on site. Administrators had learned that allowing workers to leave disrupted efficiency. The afternoon shift arrived as morning workers departed. Fresh torturers meant renewed energy for resistant subjects. The pulley systems sang with constant motion, raising and lowering bodies between devices. The soundtrack of systematized agony never ceased. Even Christmas saw reduced but continued operations. The economics justified expansion. Each conviction brought property confiscation. The facility paid for itself within 6 months. Profit margins improved as processes streamlined. The Prince Bishop reinvested in equipment upgrades, staff training, architectural improvements. The Malefizos house became a model for other territories. Delegations visited to study its methods. The blueprints were copied, adapted, spread across the empire. Bamberg had proven that persecution could be profitable when properly organized. The merger of capitalism and cruelty created unprecedented efficiency. But one torturer's daughter was keeping count, and her records would eventually damn them all. Anna Schiller, 12 years old, lived in facility housing with her father. She heard screams while eating breakfast, doing lessons, saying prayers. But Anna had learned her letters. She kept a diary, not of feelings, those were too dangerous, of numbers. 17 women on Monday, 15 on Tuesday, 2 devices needed repair, 20 on Wednesday, new pulley system installed. Her child's handwriting documented industrial murder with innocent precision. She recorded names when she heard them, ages when mentioned, homes when specified. Anna was creating evidence that no one thought to prevent. The diary grew through 1627 into 1628. Anna noted efficiency improvements, staff changes, seasonal variations in processing rates. She recorded which torturers worked fastest, which devices extracted quickest confessions, which clerks accepted bribes to alter records. Her father never knew. He was too tired after shifts to notice his daughter's writing. Anna filled 3 journals with damning data. When Swedish forces eventually took Bamberg, her records would provide the evidence historians needed. The assembly line's own attention to efficiency had created its most detailed condemnation through the systematic observations of a child who counted screams like other girls counted flowers. The museum guide knew the Iron Maiden was fake, but the tourists' disappointed faces made her lie. London's Medieval Crime Museum needed attractions in 1962. The post-war tourist boom demanded spectacle, and authentic history proved insufficiently dramatic. The Iron Maiden arrived from a German dealer who'd crafted it using medieval techniques, meaning he'd studied woodcuts and imagined the rest. The dealer had added thoughtful touches. Spikes positioned to pierce breasts and wombs specifically, a face beautiful enough to mock the victim inside, mechanisms that would force intimate violation. The mythology wrote itself. Here was peak medieval misogyny made metal, the ultimate expression of male hatred for female flesh. Margaret Thornton had started as a secretary but proved talented at spinning stories. Her guided tours drew larger crowds than the dry historians previously employed. She knew the Iron Maiden was 19th century fantasy. No medieval records mentioned such devices. Actual torture had been brutal but pragmatic, focused on confession, not elaborate death chambers. But when she explained this to visitors, their faces fell. They'd paid good money to see medieval horrors. They wanted confirmation of ancestral barbarism. So Margaret learned to lie creatively, weaving stories that satisfied bloodlust while seeming educational. The Iron Maiden became the museum's star attraction. Margaret developed elaborate narratives about its use. Young women accused of vanity, forced inside to have beauty destroyed by iron spikes. Adulteresses positioned carefully so spikes would pierce their wombs. Virgins who refused arranged marriages, violated by metal before death. Each tour added new details based on audience reaction. American tourists preferred religious persecution angles. Germans wanted mechanical precision explained. Japanese visitors appreciated aesthetic contrasts between beauty and horror. Margaret tailored her lies to market demands. But the modifications continued. The museum's new director, sensing opportunity, commissioned improvements to the Iron Maiden. Historians had complained about authenticity, removed their influence. The public wanted sexualized violence. Deliver it tastefully. The workshop that performed modifications specialized in theatrical props. They added spring-loaded mechanisms for dramatic effect. Interior spikes were repositioned based on audience feedback. The face was recarved to appear younger, more innocent. Each change pushed further from any historical reality into pure exploitation fantasy. The gift shop capitalized brilliantly. Miniature Iron Maidens became bestsellers. Keychains featuring tiny victims inside. Postcards with suggestive angles. T-shirts reading, "I survived the Iron Maiden" with bloody female silhouettes. The commercialization of imagined female torture proved endlessly profitable. School groups bought educational packets. Bachelor parties booked after-hours sessions. The museum's quarterly profits soared. Historical accuracy was sacrificed on the altar of commercial success. Photography policies evolved to maximize viral potential. The museum installed lighting that created dramatic shadows. Visitors could pose inside a replica Iron Maiden with fake spikes. Instagram-ready torture became the marketing strategy. Hashtags proliferated. Number Iron Maiden selfie, number medieval torture tour, number spiked and liked. Young women posed laughing where imaginary victims had supposedly died. The transformation from education to entertainment was complete. History became consumable content. Female pain reduced to photo opportunity. The perpetuation of profitable myths accelerated. Other museums ordered their own Iron Maidens from the German workshop. Each iteration grew more elaborate, more sexualized, more divorced from historical reality. Television documentaries featured the devices without questioning authenticity. Horror films used them as plot devices. Video games included them as environmental hazards. The lie had become more real than truth. When historians protested, they were dismissed as spoiling fun. The public knew what they wanted, medieval devices that confirmed modern prejudices. But one visitor recognized something different about this particular Iron Maiden's construction. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, a metallurgist studying historical ironwork, noticed immediately. The welding techniques were modern, the steel composition impossible before industrial smelting. The spike placement followed no medieval understanding of anatomy. She documented everything, photographing makers' marks, measuring anachronistic joints, sampling metal for laboratory analysis. Her subsequent report proved definitively that London's Iron Maiden was manufactured in 1961, using techniques and materials that would have been impossible in medieval times. The museum initially tried to suppress Hartman's findings. Too much revenue depended on the Iron Maiden myth, but she published independently, triggering investigations of other museums' collections. The cascade of revelations was devastating. Not a single medieval Iron Maiden proved authentic. All were modern fabrications, most created between 1800 and 1960. The entire mythology was retrospective projection, Victorian and modern fantasies about medieval cruelty. But the damage was done. Popular imagination had absorbed the lie too deeply. Even exposed as fiction, Iron Maidens continued drawing crowds. The hunger for sexualized female torture narratives proved stronger than truth. Museums simply added small plaques noting reconstruction while maintaining their profitable lies. Catherine woke every morning for 43 years with iron scars mapping the geography of her survival. The sun through her cottage window found the same maze of raised flesh it had illuminated for decades. Scotland, 1598 to 1641, a lifetime measured in pain's aftermath. Catherine MacLeod had survived the bridal, the boots, the pillywinks, a trifecta of torture that killed most women within days. But she'd endured, confessed to save her daughter, then recanted when safer. Now, at 67, she was St. Andrew's living reminder of what happened to women who knew too much. Her scarred tongue could barely form words. Her crushed feet required 2 canes. Her mangled hands could no longer hold a needle. Yet she lived, and in living, she testified. The other survivors found each other through whispered networks. Mary, whose breasts bore the Ripper's signature. Agnes, who breathed through a windpipe damaged by the heretic's fork. Joan, whose back showed the witch's chair's pattern burned into flesh. They met monthly in Catherine's cottage, sharing herbal remedies and harder truths. Together, they formed an archive of embodied knowledge. Their bodies were documents that couldn't be burned or denied. Every scar told a story. Every damaged joint recorded an accusation. Every laboured breath testified to systematic cruelty. They developed a coded language of survival. Finger movements when tongues couldn't speak clearly. Gentle touches to indicate pain levels. Shared glances that communicated decades of understanding. The authorities thought them broken, harmless old women gathering for gossip. They didn't recognize the resistance being planned through recipes for healing salves. They didn't understand that teaching younger women herb lore was preserving dangerous knowledge. They couldn't comprehend that damaged bodies could still harbour unbroken spirits. Catherine's granddaughter, Ishbel, visited weekly for lessons. Not the embroidery her parents believed she learned, but deeper education. How to recognize the signs of impending accusation. Which herbs could dull pain if torture came. Where to hide knowledge authorities might deem suspicious. How to survive through strategic confession. Ishbel memorized every scar's origin, understanding them as maps of potential futures. Her grandmother's body was a textbook of gendered violence, each mark a lesson in the price of female knowledge. The cottage became a pilgrimage site for women throughout Fife. They came seeking physical healing but found something more, a community of understanding. Catherine and her circle offered no comfort about justice or divine purpose. They spoke truths sharper than the devices that had cut them. Power wanted women silent, damaged, afraid. Survival itself was resistance. Living publicly, with visible scars, forced communities to see consequences. Their damaged bodies, walking through marketplaces, were protests spelled in flesh and bone. They documented everything in ways authorities couldn't recognize. Quilts, encoded with dates and names. Recipe books where ingredients spelled out accusations. Garden plots arranged to commemorate the dead. When Catherine's hands could no longer write, she dictated to Ishbel. When Agnes's voice failed, she drew. When Joan's eyes dimmed, she wove her testimony into cloth. The archive grew in formats designed to survive. Domestic arts became historical records. Women's work preserved what official histories would erase. Spring 1641 brought Catherine's final dawn. She woke as always, tracing familiar scars, breathing through familiar pain. But something had shifted in the night. Her body, that stubborn monument to survival, was finally surrendering. She called for Ishbel, passing on final instructions. The archive must be protected. The network must continue. The knowledge must survive even when the bodies that earned it couldn't. She died at sunset, her scarred hands held by women who understood the price she'd paid for their inheritance. Which brings us back to Edinburgh, where Margaret's 3 months were ending, and the crowd was about to learn exactly what she had said in church. The same crowd that had watched her bridling now gathered for the removal. The leather straps had worn grooves in her skull. The iron bit had reshaped her palate. Blood and saliva had crystallized around the mechanism. The locksmith worked carefully too fast, and her jaw might break from sudden release. The crowd pressed closer, eager to hear what words would emerge from 3 months of enforced silence. The magistrate read the formal charges one more time, disturbing the peace in church. But what had she actually said? The locksmith's key turned with a scrape of rust against metal. Margaret's jaw, clenched for 3 months around iron, couldn't immediately relax. The crowd watched her work her mouth slowly, testing freedom's dimensions. Blood ran fresh as circulation returned to compressed tissue. Her husband stepped forward with water, but she waved him away. When she finally spoke, her voice was destroyed but clear. I said, "Young woman, not virgin." Mary was a young woman. The crowd's intake of breath was audible. 3 months of torture for a translator's correction. The magistrate cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the specification. The priest whose Latin she'd corrected stood among the officials, his face flushed. Everyone knew the theological implications. If Mary was simply a young woman, not specifically a virgin, then centuries of doctrine crumbled. The foundation of female purity requirements, the justification for controlling women's bodies, the very basis for gendered punishment, all of it rested on that single mistranslated word. Margaret had committed heresy, not through blasphemy but through accuracy. Her bloody mouth had spoken linguistic truth that threatened institutional power. But Edinburgh's crowd had witnessed 3 months of Margaret's silent suffering. They'd passed her in the marketplace, seen her children's faces, watched her husband's shame. The iron weight of that suffering couldn't be balanced by abstractions of theology. Some began dispersing immediately, unwilling to process implications. Others lingered, staring at the woman whose scholarly precision had earned such brutal punishment. The children who'd watched from between their mothers' skirts would remember. They'd grow up knowing that knowledge itself could be criminal when spoken by women. Margaret's daughter Elizabeth stood at the crowd's edge, now old enough to understand her inheritance. Her mother's bridling had been her education in female boundaries. Speak truth, bleed iron. Correct authority, suffer silence. The lesson was clear, as the scars forming on her mother's face. Yet Elizabeth had also learned resistance. For 3 months, she'd communicated with her bridled mother through touch, through presence, through defiant love. She'd seen that silence couldn't destroy truth, only delay its speaking. The bridal had failed its deepest purpose, creating compliant daughters from punished mothers. The theological architecture that transformed Eve into iron remained intact despite Margaret's revelation. Workshops continued forging gendered devices. Courts continued ordering female-specific punishments. Husbands continued requesting domestic corrections. The machinery of oppression ground forward, too invested in its own momentum to stop for one woman's linguistic accuracy. But cracks were spreading through foundations. Every woman who heard Margaret's truth would remember. Every daughter who saw her scarred face would question. The slow erosion of unexamined authority had begun. Modern museums still display these devices, though rarely with Margaret's story attached. Gift shops sell miniature bridals as novelties. Tour guides describe medieval barbarism as safely historical. The comfortable distance allows consumption without contemplation. Visitors photograph themselves with replica devices. posting to social media with ironic captions. The transformation from torture to entertainment completes itself. Through commercial sanitization, pain becomes profit when sufficiently separated from its reality. Yet the device's true legacy persists in subtler forms. Women still face punishment for speaking inconvenient truths. The mechanisms have evolved. Professional destruction replacing iron bridles, social media harassment replacing public squares, economic violence replacing physical torture. The underlying dynamics remain unchanged. Female speech that challenges male authority still triggers systematic response. The materials shifted from iron to silicon, but the intent endures. Silence remains the prescribed cure for female knowledge. The Scold's bridle waits in museums, its iron testament to Christianity's transformation from liberation theology to gendered oppression. Each device carries invisible histories: Margaret's blood, Catherine's scars, countless women whose names weren't recorded, but whose suffering was precisely documented. These weren't medieval anomalies, but logical extensions of doctrine that positioned women as inherently requiring correction. The leap from Eve's apple to Edinburgh's marketplace was shorter than we comfort ourselves believing. Margaret lived another 20 years, her scarred tongue carefully forming words that mattered. She never again spoke in church, but she taught her daughter Latin, Greek, Hebrew. She created a generation of women who could read original texts, who knew when translations lied, who understood that knowledge was power, especially when forbidden. Her bridling had failed its purpose, creating silence, and succeeded in something else entirely. She'd become living proof that truth survived torture, that accuracy mattered more than authority, that women's voices would persist despite every device designed to still them. The iron had bitten through her tongue, but not her truth, and that truth echoes still, whenever women dare correct the record of their own oppression.